some cases, I think we got a little above that. We probably got to about a 42 or 40-inch pipe. But the idea was to not have 90-inch storm sewers running down through the development. So there again is kind of the unified sizing criteria that was used. And one thing about Ankeny, if you're familiar with it, there are a lot of hydric soils, there's a lot of high groundwater table. So a lot of people from the start were saying, hey, can we even do this in Ankeny? We really lent itself to us. Well, one of the selection matrices in the stormwater management manual, we started looking at, okay, from different soils, maybe we need to do things more with wetlands and ponds and things like that. But we could still do bioretention and other things in select areas as long as we have under drains. But we used that as a criteria to figure out what different practices should go where. And then there was a series of just kind of there was a stormwater design guidelines that were developed by Wink Associates out of Denver, where we took some of these concepts and just kind of, it's like an idea book for how you could manage stormwater at different sites. Because again, we were kind of trending a little bit ahead of the actual stormwater management manual being done. So we were trying to give, and we didn't know how much of this would be done by NILIS or by other designers, or how much of this would be done by GRA, or how much of this we're going to sell off. So they wanted to make sure that there were standards in place that if they sold part of it off, they could convey what the design requirements were going to be. So then as we really started to refine it into like, okay, well, what are the watersheds? As we start to actually develop this area, what are these new watersheds going to be? Where could these regional practices go? So you can see some of these little areas that are marked with an oval are where they decided that they were going to have regional stormwater practices. And then how would we get water to those areas? And from that, we developed an overall stormwater management report that set the guidelines that other designers could use to understand what the requirements were. And we went through each one of these doing a preliminary sizing of what the release rates and the area was going to be necessary to accomplish this. And what they ended up deciding at the end of the day was kind of a blend, where these regional areas would do a lot of the heavy lifting for the big storm events, for one part. And the goal for those was to take the outflow rates down to natural levels by the time it left Prairie Trail. By the time it left it. Some of the sites that were in the middle of development could release a little bit more water, but by the time it got to the last of the basins before it would leave Prairie Trail, it had to be down to natural rates, which were defined for this site as a curve number of 58. So meadow in good condition, like a B-type soil, is what they used for the release rates at these sites. In addition to the big storm management, they were also to provide water quality for the single-family residential areas, because the city didn't think they could be requiring individual homeowners to be putting in rain gardens and rain barrels and doing stuff in the backyard. They thought that could be kind of an inspection nightmare, so they didn't want to have to go do that. So the water quality for the single-family sites was put into these regional wetlands and ponds and things like that. But for the higher intensity uses like commercial sites and multifamily sites, they were expected to do more of the stormwater, the water quality management on site. They could put the water into the regional facility for the big storms, but for the smaller storms, for the water quality, they would treat that at the site level. So that's kind of how it ended up all getting balanced out. So those are kind of the standards that were developed. We then got into conceptual design. They wanted to have a couple of featured lakes. We started to develop neighborhood plans around that and figuring out how we were going to operate and maintain all these systems. And what the city ended up deciding to do is that for a lot of these areas, because they'd be in these green belts, they accepted them as part of the park grant. So today, there was some initial contract work that was done in some of these areas for maintenance, but then eventually the city took over the maintenance of these areas. I guess I covered a lot of this, so I don't need to restate that. So this is, when I left NILIS, this is what the master plan looked like in 2014. So it was still kind of following the same course, although some of the developments had morphed a little bit on how the streets ended up actually laying out. And I'll give you some kind of vacation style photos for what has been happening. So in 2014, this is kind of the status of how things looked. You could see some housing going in. Chautauqua Lake was being built and filled at the time. These are the two ponds that are kind of the central axis of the development and other features around the development. They also experimented with a few things over time. In some of the first phases, they did these little stormwater bump outs where the water could go in and go through some grass before it would get into the inlets, and they would go through that before it would get into the regional area. After a while, they just decided that they didn't want that incorporated in some of the later phases because of some of the maintenance issues and things with that. So we looked at other ways to do some of that pre-treatment before it got in without doing these little bump outs. There are also alley areas that have little pocket parks. So some of the pavement and drives and those just kind of run off the edge or the curb. The water just kind of runs off through the grass before it gets into the inlet for pre-treatment. In some of the earlier phases too, we experimented with doing forced pavers down the center of the alley. And I think in theory it was kind of a good idea. But one of the difficult things is with all the home site construction that went on, it was just too difficult to keep them clean. Maybe if we were able to come back after all the houses were built and replace them or take out some of the concrete or somehow put gravel around the center and then put it back, maybe it could have worked. But over time, these things just ended up getting too much silt in them, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't keep the construction site runoff out of them. So in later phases, they did away with this approach. They did, in the Cascade Falls parking lot, they did this kind of infiltration trench. This could have been a biocell, but at the time, I think they just wanted the kind of more of this kind of management system. But still, the water goes off the open curbs and then goes down through the grass, through pre-treatment, and then gets infiltrated into the rock before it goes into a subdrain and then offsite. This is just after construction, one of the smaller detention areas. So there's a couple forebays here, and the water kind of works its way around to a larger pond. This is another picture of one of the forebays. And this is a water level control structure that was installed. This is kind of the lowest stage of a multi-stage outlet, so it's actually drawing water from below the surface of the pond as it outlets, and you can see that it's just the water level is set by the gates that are put into that structure so they can raise or lower that water level as they need for maintenance. And then other things that have kind of developed over time. This is a picture from 2003. This is Cascade Falls. Water comes into a couple different basins with stormwater wetlands, and then there's a larger stormwater wetland here, and then the water eventually goes down to Chautauqua Lake. This is that stormwater wetland as it was being built. This is like 2010, 9, something like that. It's been there for a while. One thing that they did do in this wetland, that I'll show you another one that they did, this one did not have like a short-term maintenance contract. So we did the initial seeding and planting, but pretty quickly this one got taken over by cattails. So they've had to do a lot of work on the back end, keeping willows and cattails out of this particular wetland. This is another picture from the other side. 2014. This is a wet swale. We called it a bioswale at the time, but then they changed how they designed those. So this does not have like an underdrain, but again, it's a very, very flat vegetated swale that slows the water down. And this is the wetland that did get a short-term maintenance contract. And at the time I designed this, I thought this one might be a little smaller than we'd like it to be, but because they did that short-term maintenance, this one has been in a lot better shape. I think throughout the years, you can see a lot more diversity of vegetation. There are some cattails, but they're just little isolated spots. So again, if you had the opportunity to do a short-term maintenance contract, that's how they structured this one, where the initial, there's two contracts. One did the mass grading of the site, put in all the pipes and things, but that second contract came in, and then they did the dormant seeding, and then they had 2 years of maintenance work that they would do to keep the wave pressure down and maintain it. So this is several years after installation now. It's still looking really, really good. This is a channel that had about 15 feet of fall. I showed a picture of, it was actually a box culvert before the development here that was suspended out in the air. You could actually jump out of it 15 feet down to the channel below. It had eaten its way down. So we had to do some drop structures through here to get rid of that grade. And this goes into this lake, what's called a vintage lake. So there's a fishing pier there. And this multi-stage outlet, there's a lot, about 600 acres of water that comes into the development from upstream, so we have to pass some of that through. So we had to do a much larger structure to get that kind of weir length that we need to pass that larger flow. But we did it with multi-stages, so in most days, the water's only going over this middle pier, so we get still that small storm control that we want, even in a pond that's designed like this. And then this is some pictures from the assessments we did for the city as part of their stormwater management report. This was done just this last year. So this is kind of what it's looking like today. So you can still see some of the, the wetlands areas still looking really, really good. The native areas are more established today. And then we head down to the south pond. Again, it has a multi-stage outlet. And I was told, when we get into some of the discussions about TR 55 and things like that, when we designed this, I was told that Tier 55 was going to be maybe a little too conservative, and maybe it was going to estimate the flow rates too high, and we would never, ever see this pond full. I have seen weir go over this entire weir at least 4 times since it's been built. And it takes about a 10 or a 25-year storm to go over all 4 of the weirs. So I would not say it's overly conservative. It's conservative, but not too conservative, because it really is operating essentially like we thought it would be given the storm events that we've seen. And they did do some porous pavers in the district as well. So again, this is kind of a higher intensity use, so they had to manage some of the stormwater water quality on site. This is a paved drain cistern that's at Jethro's, so if you decide to go get some barbecue later today, go down Park by the lake and you can see the pavers down there. I haven't been out there recently to see how well they're cleaning them up. Hopefully they're doing a great job. This is right after they went in. I don't know, I see a smirk, hopefully. I don't know. Amy's not going to say anything. Pictures from this last year. So you can see, and we did a lot of native vegetation around the lakes. And one thing I would say that's done is it really has kept the geese population down. You will go out there and you will see geese from time to time, but it seems like there's usually a pair or maybe 3 or 4. But then you go to some of the more manicured lakes around the community and you'll sometimes see hundreds or more, So we have seen that. And then there were some channel improvements that went on downstream. This is what it looked like before the development occurred. So, there's about 200 acres of developed land at the very top of the watershed. So 50 years of drainage coming down through the corridor, a lot of erosion. So it needed some repairs to a lot of these areas. I was about 15 feet tall when we walked out before construction. And all of this was done as part of a city contract. They came in and did both the 2-stage contract where they did the grading and then they did the vegetation management. And this is from this year, how it looks like today. So you can see everything's still pretty stable. And actually, these photos were taken after the 10-inch rain event. This was actually, I have 2019, this is actually from last year. So this was last October, but it was after that 10-inch rain that happened in Ankeny, and the corridor was actually still in really pretty good shape. There were a couple little small pockets of erosion, but mainly it was cosmetic. But I will highlight there were some areas where, this is on the DMAC side of the creek, and we just cleared and graded this like less than 10 years ago. But you can see like the volunteer trees have really come in fast. So, if you're trying to maintain native vegetation there to be your erosion-resistant vegetation, your deep-rooted, if this gets shaded out and that all dies off, then we're going to be more prone to erosion again. So it just kind of highlights the need if you're going to do corridor work to kind of, it could have been just an annual mowing or maybe a once every couple season burn. But if you let it go for 10 years, now you're actually going to have to come in there with some equipment and cut stuff down. And then finally, we'll finish up with looking at Chautauqua Lake. This was built around 2014. This is heading into the lake. These are the wetland systems that clean the water before it goes into the lake. The other ponds I showed you had a pretty elaborate outlet structure because of how much drainage area we're going into it. This still has a couple hundred acres, but it has a more modest outlet structure. It's basically just a precast area inlet. Is the second stage. You can see the water level control structure sticking up there. So again, we're pulling, the daily flow gets pulled from below the surface into there. And as the water builds up about 2 feet higher, then it starts to spill into this structure. So not a very expensive structure to build for outlet control. This is the dam. This is looking north across the lake. I thought this photo was kind of cool because we took it again after that 10-inch rain event. And you can see the emergency spillway for the lake is over here. And you can see how the grass is all matted down. So you can tell that the spillway actually operated the way that it's supposed to, that we got beyond, that was about a 1,000-year storm. So it got beyond what this was designed to handle, and it spilled over the emergency spillway and ran down through the grasses. And it's funny, the grasses are still laid over about 2 months after the rainfall event. So you can tell it was really roaring through there. But then downstream of the lake, the whole point of these systems is to slow the water, to have it more stable. Even after such a big rain event, this is the channel downstream, still completely stable, very little visible signs of erosion. In fact, you can see a lot of that taller vegetation again just kind of flapped over, and it's still kind of waiting to pop back up. And that is the 10 million mile an hour tour of Prairie Trail.
You are right on.
Oh, good.
Like exactly.